Sometimes people come to my channel and repeat a piece of propaganda put out by gun companies, ammunition companies, and their favorite little talking muppet they jam their hands up the ass of, Le Puy, or whatever his name is, Le Pew, in the NRA. All gun laws are unconstitutional. By definition, by saying it, you're also saying the Second Amendment is also unconstitutional because it makes a regulation. It's a self-terminating cliche, but here we go. The consensus for almost, actually literally the entirety of American legal history was the right to keep and bear arms was a right for those called to military service, the militia, not an individual right. The original enrolled joint resolution passed by Congress that was written by James Madison that we commonly call the Second Amendment had several versions because, honestly, if you're not aware of it, people didn't do spell check, and there's a comma in some copies of it, and the original copy is yada yada. And you can look up the framers of the Constitution and why they said what they said. And if you're working off their intent, you'd have to take into account people who disagreed with the Second Amendment being there at all, and others who wanted to insert things about slave patrols. So you would be backing an argumentum that would be very stupid. But anyway, 1789, September 25th. Now this is where things get annoying because there's several versions of it with slightly different punctuation and cadence. So people are allowed to pick and choose. This immediately brings into question whether or not the framers of the Constitution were being unambiguous. They were being ambiguous on purpose. They did a compromised set of two sentences here that are garbage, and they're mushed together as one. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. By making this assertion, this is not implying it is saying it's for a militia. At one time, the argument people would make is that the only weapons you were allowed to have were military weapons, not hunting weapons, under the Second Amendment. People argued that, including the National Riflemen's Association, that the Second Amendment was only to be applied to what we would now call assault weapons and assault rifles. And real, because it was about the militia. But the trouble is, militia is an antiquated concept under those rules. Yes, it is, because at the time it was whatever people wanted it to be in whatever state, which meant it was subject to state regulation and definitions. And they changed them. But all laws are unconstitutional, essentially. You are not allowed to yell fire in a theater. You're also not allowed to do a parade up and down the road at 2 a.m. waking people up. There are some limitations on what you're allowed to get away with. Trolling behavior is the easiest way to suddenly end up with a bunch of regulations. Well, what happened? Anytime you see a law passed that just seems out of nowhere, it's because some asshole was being an asshole, because assholes are going to be assholes. 1991, conservative former Chief Justice Warren Burger, on video, said if he were writing the Bill of Rights now, there wouldn't be any Second Amendment. The idea that it was an individual right to bear arms, as guaranteed on a federal level, is a fraud on the American people by special interest groups. He didn't outright say the NRA, I guess, but that's what he's referring to at the time. The National Riflemen's Association was a bunch of FUDs originally. Then they decided that they wanted to expand things. Now, I want to point out something, that conventionally in society, people would just go to the Army surplus store and get equipment, because if it was no longer used regularly in the Army, you would use it for going hunting. You could use what we would now call an AR-15. It actually had a real name at the time, a real product at one time. A non-militarized version, meaning it's not a fully automatic or select fire weapon version of it, or conversion, or demilled to make sure you couldn't do that anymore. Rifle. But most people would pick whatever rifle would do the job. Or shotgun. And at one time in the 1930s, again, while the Second Amendment was still only interpreted for a militia, there was a move to ban handguns because they were excessively represented in criminal activity and underrepresented in self-defense. At least that was the perception. And then they backed off on it and left a bunch of language in that made it to where we have short-barrel rifle and short-barrel shotgun rules that are stupid, that don't need to be there. There's also a set of rules about dangerous, what was the wording? Dangerous or unusual weapons. Weapons that don't make any sense or seem convoluted, or are unusual weapons that are very specific purposes. Like my favorite, self-defense only firearms that don't actually kill anybody. They're mostly for self-defense so that you can ward off an attacker, but become lethal if they get close enough for you to shoot them. If they're close enough for you to shoot them and kill them, they were attacking you. Then it becomes lethal self-defense rather than non-lethal. But particularly dangerous weapons would qualify under weapons that are unsafe for the user or unsafe for the general public because they don't aim correctly. See also machine guns you can't keep control over, which means you would need to have foregrips and a bunch of other things mandatory. In 2008, the Second Amendment was remade into an individual constitutional right. So until 2008, no, it didn't guarantee a damn thing, and the court said it didn't guarantee your individual right. But they tolerated individual right interpretation by people. They tolerated people saying it says shall not be infringed. People have t-shirts that say that. They ignore the entire Constitution. They ignore the fact that black people were freed. Yes, I'm pushing that down people's throats. The people who scream and misquote, scream these thought-terminating cliches, and who misquote the Bible at you at full volume, are the same kind of people who ignore the parts of the Constitution that they'd like to get rid of. Like, we all have the right to have our vote counted, and you can't do a goddamn thing about it, and you all failed on a certain day and a certain year that we aren't allowed to mention anymore on YouTube because they'll flag you. But anyway, the Second Amendment was allowed to be applied to individuals, not groups, not hunting groups, not nothing like that, and didn't require the states to give permission. Okay, there are limitations on constitutional rights already in existence. You can't decide that this is the only one that can't have limitations. It's not acceptable. The limitations on what you're allowed to do as a quote-unquote right are legally acceptable for very logical reasons. The government can ban firearms for felons, mentally ill people, guns in sensitive places like schools, government buildings, or whatever. You can decide not to limit them, you can limit them. It can impose conditions and qualifications for commercial sale of guns. And you can prohibit or regulate unusual weapons or dangerous ones. Like a poorly made firearm that isn't really up to snuff could be regulated simply based on the fact that it's a Saturday night special and isn't designed properly. Meanwhile, you can go buy a used gun that'll last literally a lifespan. This was all part of the same decision that allowed you to have a Second Amendment individually. It's part of the damn decision. Well, I don't like those rules. You can't do that, but you want to invalidate the whole thing? Then you start back at the beginning where it's militia only. And then suddenly you have to be a declared militia by the state, not a self-declared militia. All self-declared militias would become illegal because of the keep and bear arms factor. By the way, that was one of the rules before 2008, one of many rules. It was implied by some cities and counties and states that if you claimed to be a militia group, you had to be authorized. Authorized militias are the only militias. We call them the Army Reserve and National Guard. Those are the militias. They are authorized and authenticated and validated. If you claim we're part of a militia for the state of Oregon and we're going to go break some laws, by definition you're not a militia. You're a criminal organization under the color of constitutional law. That ain't right. That's what was decided by the Founding Fathers. The whole point of them mentioning militias is they wanted to make sure the militias were regulated by them, a well-regulated militia, not your bullshit ass out in the forest playing paintball games, but you suddenly decide to switch over to live ammo because you're morons. Next, the real simple factor is we, the people, have the right to just simply decide we want our representatives to go to Washington en masse and rescind the Second Amendment entirely. It mentions militias in a form that aren't used anymore, and it mentions the Second Amendment that a lot of you people have been shaking in people's faces. I dare you to take away my rights. Okay. I don't want that happening. If anybody isn't aware of this, yes, a lot of you watching are ignoring this. I'm in favor of your Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms, to make, keep, and bear arms. And I think there should be more than just the sporting regulation limitation or exception. The country of France allows for an exemption for self-defense only 12-gauge handguns because they're loaded up with low-power rounds and they're limited like a flare gun. They're just basically an all-metal flare gun that you put in a 2-inch limited shell. And a lot of you already know that can be really, pretty peppy, but it is less likely to hurt somebody up the street. It takes all the really bad characteristics of a shotgun and chunks it down to a flare gun size, slightly longer barrel, and makes it into suddenly a very useful firearm for self-defense only. We don't have a self-defense exemption. The United States needs one. I'm in favor of everybody being able to own a 12-gauge flare gun. Made out of metal, and you can load whatever you want into it. If you're in a city that requires a permit for concealed carry, fine. Take off the barrel, put a 26-inch long hunk of water pipe on it, and say, now it's a firearm, no regulations needed. And then you carry it blade style on your back and be done with it. Or let us have our fucking flare guns like I want. I'm really an advocate for that. I'm an agitator for it. But it's not under Second Amendment under militia. It's Second Amendment under what was understood by about half, but slightly less than half the people that made that rule. The Second Amendment was made by the other group of people that didn't want cowboy-style shootings going on. They didn't want the Old West. This is pre-Old West. I mean, seriously, look at the timing. Very Old West. But the point is, a majority of them were not in favor of your individual right. This had nothing to do with it. They didn't want the government regulating individual rights. Therefore, they weren't establishing them. They were establishing only things the government could control and discussing this. There's the argument, well, this is against tyranny and stuff. Yes, I'm sure you're going to bring that up. And there's also the argument that I'm linking down below in the description. Wikipedia, Second Amendment to the United States Constitution to maintain slavery. That was one of the considerations they bandied about openly. It's part of the discussion. But, well, we'll just ignore that. If you ignore any part of history or any part of the facts that exist, any reality, I have no interest in listening to your argument. It's like screaming, it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Okay. But in the Bible, it lists Sodom and Gomorrah. You can read I forgot the name of it. It's the one that everybody bookmarked but didn't admit it. Why is this page dog-eared with all this description of erotica in the Bible? No reason. All of you out there that pick and choose what you wish to believe are not allowed to have an argument with us normal grown-ups. And yes, again, I'm perfectly in favor of the right to keep arms. I'm more in favor of you making one. I'm in favor of us having that right. We have a government and an NRA that's okay with us losing the ability to make our own firearms. I find that upsetting. You should too. That's about it. So someone coming by, all gun laws are unconstitutional. Yes, including the Second Amendment, by your own admission. It says specifically, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Making a law mentioning you have a right can be considered infringement because a bunch of you out there mean that it excludes other things. The right to keep and bear arms. But it doesn't mention making it. So suddenly, I'm not allowed to make guns. Well, that's not the interpretation. Yes, it is. You people out there, you, that keep bringing up this subject and misquoting it and misrepresenting it and lying about James Madison or somebody else saying the government should fear its people, the people should not fear the government. None of the founding fathers ever made that statement. That was made after the year 1900. You are lying about your own evidence. Most of you are. It's fucking irritating. Stop it. And that means you're also lying about what were the actual motivations of these people. It's like lying about, well, the South started a war with the North or vice versa over slavery. Or no, it wasn't. Yes, it was. It was over slavery and 100 other things, but it was about slavery and very majority of it for some people. Well, I don't want to talk about that. Then that means you're ignoring the facts. Ignoring any of the facts means that I don't have to believe that you're paying attention to any of them. If you're going to pick and choose the pieces of reality you want to have an argument about, that's fine. That's a tactic. But that's not honest. So no, gun laws are not unconstitutional, and it is just a piece of paper, and it means whatever we say it does this week. Yes, I'm quoting somebody evil. But don't literally go after pissing off, hopefully not the majority of people in this country, because they will rewrite that thing. The constitutional amendment, Second Amendment, wasn't part of the original list of deals. That's why it's an amendment. It can be amended again. Stop poking. Stop poking me. Anyway, that's it. That's all I got to say. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that. And the person who posts over and over again it's unconstitutional, you're simply wrong, and I'm not letting you post it anymore.